Well, thank you very much, Warren, and thank you all for coming and permitting me to say something about my new book, which Righteous Warrior just appeared about 2 weeks ago, so it's more or less hot off the press. What I thought I'd do this evening is talk a little bit about the contours of the book and try to focus on the some of the conclusions I reached, and particularly on I think the relevance of Jesse Helms for 2008. Most of us know something about Jesse Helms. Here in North Carolina, he's a person of immediate identification. That may not be quite so true in the rest of the United States, but certainly here in North Carolina, Jesse Helms is a figure who has almost iconic status, and he's a person that political leader who polarized. He's a person that almost immediately, in terms of his thought and action, had the effect of dividing people. And to a large extent, I think that that polarizing effect of Helms has, in some respects, obscured his significance, his historical significance. To people on the left, liberals, people on the progressive side of the political spectrum, there's been a tendency, I think, to write him off, to see him as somewhat buffoonish and to see him as ineffectual. And I think equally to people on the right, people of a conservative persuasion, there's been, among many conservatives at least, a tendency to be slightly embarrassed by Jesse Helms and some of his hard-nosed tactics. So the result has been to sort of obscure Jesse Helms, and he retired in 2002, so we're 6 years out of his political career. And to some extent, I think he's sort of gotten at least partially forgotten. And so one of the points of my book is to sort of look back on Helms and sort of assess his impact, which I argue in the book was significant. In fact, I think it wouldn't be an exaggeration to describe Helms as one of the major political players of the last half of the 20th century, and certainly one of the more important North Carolinians of the 20th century. In a lot of different respects, he had a wide-ranging impact on political culture, on political life, and the way that policy and politics were practiced in the last third of the 20th century into our own time. To a large extent, the conservative revolution, the emergence of a new kind of American right that occurred after the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, were the culmination of a long-standing strategy on the part of Jesse Helms in an effort to change politics in a fundamental kind of way. Most of us know something about Helms, but let me just give you a thumbnail sketch. He was born in Monroe, North Carolina, grew up the son of a police officer, Jesse Helms Sr., who eventually became sheriff of Monroe, small town of 2,000 or 3,000 people. He, from an early age, wanted to be a journalist, was fascinated with journalism, and in the yearbook of his graduating year in 1938 at Monroe High School, the two things that are noteworthy about Helms, the first is that he announces in the yearbook his intention to be a leading journalist. And the second noteworthy thing is that his classmates voted him most obnoxious member of their class. He attended college for 2 years and left college after 1 year at Wingate, which was then a junior college, and then 1 year at Wake Forest. And then plunged into journalism and worked for the Raleigh News and Observer and the Raleigh Times, which was the evening newspaper. And then was in the war, in the Navy, and after the war got involved in radio broadcasting. And subsequently was actively involved for the rest of his non-political career in radio and television broadcasting. Indeed, from 1960 to 1972, he was the person who ran WRAL-TV here in Raleigh, and as part of those 12 years, he provided daily editorials, 5-minute editorials about a range of topics. 1972, he was elected to the United States Senate and served in the Senate for the next 30 years, 5 terms in the Senate. So his career is really defined, I think, by several things, but the most important, I think, is his impact in coalescing a new sort of conservatism that we see in this country beginning in the 1960s. And what I'd like to do for the rest of the time I have tonight is to talk about his lasting impact and his legacy. The first thing that might be said is he had a significant impact on politics, particularly between 1972, his first election in the Senate, and his retirement in 2002, that 30-year period. If you look at politics, what politics was like in 1972, and you look at what politics was like in 2002, I think most people would agree that there was a revolution that took place in the way politics was practiced. In 1972, politics was still fairly personal. It was practiced on a personal level. It involved a lot of local organization, sort of retail politics was the typical pattern in 1972. There wasn't much advertising that was done on television, in fact, virtually none. In Helms's Senate campaign of 1972, his first one, almost all the advertising was done in newspapers and very little in television. By 2002, television is everything, and political advertising is based on heavy use of polling and the heavy use of poll-driven media. And Helms, to a large extent, was involved in this revolution that took place. He wasn't solely responsible for it. And here, the key organization, and I spend a good bit of time in my book talking about this, was the Congressional Club, which was organized in 1973 after Helms's first Senate campaign in 1972. It was organized in 1973 to retire Helms's debt in 1972, and then became fantastically successful as what became Helms's main political organization until the mid-1990s. And the Congressional Club was successful because, to begin with, its ability to raise huge amounts of money. Beginning in the mid-'70s, and especially by about 1978-79, the club, as it was known, became a money machine. And it developed, for its day, the most sophisticated fundraising operation in the country. It was based on direct mail fundraising. And it depended upon a huge national database of names, which constituted a kind of national conservative constituency. The vast majority of the contributors to the Congressional Club, and they raised millions in the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s, the vast majority were people outside North Carolina. They were people who were they were movement conservatives. They were people who were dedicated to the kinds of things that Jesse Helms was dedicated to. That's one noteworthy characteristic of the Congressional Club's fundraising. The other is that most of them were small contributors. The average contributor to the Congressional Club contributed about $30. And only 5% of the club's revenue came from political action committees. So that's sort of an interesting thing, and it provided an unusual degree of independence for the club and its ability to run political campaigns without any debts to pay, any IOUs that they had to pay off. The other way in which the club is revolutionary, I would argue, is its use of advertising. And beginning in the 1980s and into the 1990s, the Congressional Club becomes very, very effective at using television advertising as a way to run political campaigns. Again, that's new to this era. There's a realization that takes place among Jesse Helms's political advisors that the way to win campaigns is to use lots and lots of television campaigning. And advertising, especially negative advertising, attack ads, become the trademark of the way that the club operates. By the 1980s, the extensive use of advertising is really very remarkable, and it's devised all in-house by the Congressional Club and by the operatives of the Congressional Club. The 1984 campaign and the 1990 campaign are the two outstanding examples of the use of advertising and the heavy use of negative advertising in particular to define candidates and to win elections. I can talk more about 1984. It's a complex election, but it's a very interesting election. An election, of course, that Jesse Helms ran against Jim Hunt, very popular incumbent governor. The other thing I'd mentioned that's a key to the success of the Congressional Club and is part of this big change that's taking place in politics is the use of polling. There, of course, had been public opinion polling used by political organizations, but the Congressional Club refines it to a science, and they're able to connect their polling to their advertising, and they're able to use advertising in a very precise kind of way, in a way that's way ahead of their adversaries for their day. Certainly this is true in 1984 and 1990. In another way as well, the Helms legacy extends into politics, and I would argue that Jesse Helms was instrumental in mobilizing a national conservative movement in the 1970s and 1980s. The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 marked a critical moment in the history of modern conservatism. Helms was elected to the Senate in 1972, and soon after he was elected to the Senate, he began to pound away and work assiduously to put together elements of a conservative coalition. Interesting relationship between Jesse Helms and Ronald Reagan. Helms had known Reagan since the 1960s, soon after Reagan was elected to the governorship in 1966. And Helms endorsed Reagan when he ran for president in the 1970s, in 1976, when he challenged the incumbent president, Gerald Ford. The story goes like this, and that is that Ronald Reagan was about to go down in defeat in 1976. He had lost 4 or 5 consecutive primaries to Gerald Ford, and Reagan's operation came to North Carolina in the North Carolina primary of March of 1976, and pretty much Reagan turned over the operation of the campaign to Helms's people, to the Congressional Club. And they won the North Carolina primary of 76, March 76, and that turned the whole thing around. And although Reagan was not nominated in 1976, he became the heir presumptive for 1980 and was set up pretty much to be nominated as the Republican candidate in 1980. So Reagan, in a sense, for a long time, owed Helms his political survival, because if he had lost in March of 76, that would be pretty much it, pretty much the end of his presidential ambitions. One of the things that Helms is very successful at in the 1970s and 1980s is defining a kind of national conservative agenda of issues. And he puts together a set of issues that become part of a coalesced conservative movement. The thing that holds the movement together and the message that Helms is promoting is a common hostility to liberalism, to New Deal liberalism, but the kind of amorphous liberal state that conservatives such as Helms are revolting against. This kind of an anti-liberal umbrella that brings together a lot of different elements. Opposition to communism. Helms is a strong anti-communist and an unyielding anti-communist. He, from the 1950s on, is an unyielding anti-communist, and even in the 1970s, when relations between Russia, the Soviet Union, and the United States ease, Helms insists that the hard line be maintained. So he opposes the détente of the 1970s, and he opposes the easing of relations and arms control treaties that are taking place in the 70s. And he supports Ronald Reagan, of course, who was a dedicated Cold Warrior and runs on that in 1980. Helms is also an opponent of civil rights and translates that message into a kind of conservative message. He opposes the Brown decision of 1954, which, of course, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools were now unconstitutional and illegal. And throughout the 1950s, he opposed federal intervention in Southern race relations. He opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He opposed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and consistently opposed federal intervention and, on the one hand, and the civil rights movement and the leadership of the civil rights movement on the other. He was a strong detractor of Martin Luther King. He was a critic, consistent critic of King all through the 60s. And of course, when Congress attempted to make Martin Luther King's birthday a national holiday in 1983, Helms launched a filibuster against the legislation, which went nowhere, but helped define a very, very clear message. All through the 1960s, Helms was an anti-1960s person. He was suspicious of campus revolt. He was suspicious of the sexual revolution.